In 1848, a Swiss immigrant named Meyer Guggenheim landed in Philadelphia with a case of stove polish, and as the family story goes, 11 cents left in his pocket. By the time he died, his sons controlled a fifth of the world's silver, copper, and lead. History tends to file a story like that under luck, but the pattern repeats itself too often to leave it there. A weaver's son in Augsburg ends up financing an emperor's election. A washerwoman in Mississippi quietly funds a university. A llama herder chasing a stray animal up a mountainside stumbles onto the richest silver deposit anyone has ever found. Across 5,000 years, wealth has moved downward from the powerful only rarely. Far more often it has moved upward, out of a workshop, a wagon, a ship's cabin, a prison cell for unpaid debts, and into a fortune nobody standing there at the time could have predicted. This list gathers 50 of those climbs, the famous ones and the ones history very nearly let slip through its fingers. Some of these people built things that still carry their names on storefronts and street signs. A few of them lost everything again just as fast, which says something on its own about how thin the line between rags and riches really is. None of it is a plan to follow. It is simply what certain people in certain rooms at certain moments actually did, and what happened to them afterward. One of these 50 made his largest fortune almost by accident, and spent the rest of his life watching other men grow rich from it instead of him. Andrew Carr. Nagy began working in a Pittsburgh cotton mill at age 13 for about $1.20 a week, tending bobbins 12 hours at a stretch in a room thick with lint. His family had crossed from Scotland with almost nothing after his father's handloom weaving business collapsed under the advance of factory machines, the very kind of machine young Andrew would spend his life mastering from the other side. The bobbin mill was miserable, but it did not last long. Carnegie's next job, running messages for a telegraph office, put him within earshot of businessmen discussing railroads, iron, and the coming boom in industrial materials. He learned to read the telegraph by ear before most operators learned it by sight, and that small skill got him noticed. A railroad superintendent hired him as a personal secretary and telegraph operator, and Carnegie spent his 20s absorbing how the rail business actually worked, from freight schedules to bridge construction to the raw iron that held it all together. What set him apart was not invention. Carnegie did not design a better furnace or discover a new process. He noticed, earlier and more clearly than most of his peers, that the country's railroads would need enormous quantities of steel rail, and that steel, not iron, was where the money of the coming decades would actually sit. He moved into iron manufacturing, then pushed hard into the Bessemer steel process that other men were still treating as a curiosity. He drove cost down relentlessly, undercut competitors, and bought out rivals when they weakened. By the time he sold his steel company at the turn of the century, the boy who had once smelled of cotton lint controlled more of America's steel capacity than anyone alive. He spent much of his final decades giving the fortune away, funding libraries in towns he had never visited. The mill where he started still stands, mostly forgotten, a few blocks from a river that once carried his steel downstream by the ton. The libraries remain longer than the mills that paid for them. John D. Rockefeller's first job at 16 paid him about 50 cents a day as an assistant bookkeeper for a small produce commission firm in Cleveland. He kept the ledgers with an almost devotional precision, tracking every incoming shipment and outgoing payment down to the cent, and he later called the day he got that job one of the most important of his life. More important, he said, than any deal he made afterward. That devotion to small numbers never left him. When he moved into oil refining in his 20s, a business full of wildcatters chasing sudden strikes, Rockefeller approached it the way he had approached the produce ledgers, methodically, unglamorously, obsessed with shaving fractions of a cent off the cost of producing a barrel of kerosene. He negotiated better freight rates than his competitors by guaranteeing rail companies steady, predictable volume. He built his own barrel-making operation to cut costs on containers other refiners simply bought at market price. None of it was thrilling. All of it added up. Standard Oil grew not through a single dramatic breakthrough, but through 1,000 small efficiencies, compounding against rivals who were still running their businesses on instinct and hope. Where a competitor's refinery might waste a fraction of every barrel, Rockefeller's did not, and over years that fraction became a fortune large enough to reshape how governments thought about the size a single company should be allowed to reach. Regulators eventually broke Standard Oil into dozens of pieces, several of which grew into major oil companies in their own right. He kept meticulous personal account books his entire life, long after the ledgers had stopped mattering to anyone but him. The bookkeeper's habits outlasted the empire they built. Gabrielle Channel's mother died of tuberculosis when the girl was 11, and her father, a travelling peddler with little interest in raising 6 children, left her and her sisters at a Catholic orphanage in rural France. The nuns there ran a strict, quiet institution built around sewing. Girls spent hours each day at needlework, learning to cut fabric cleanly and stitch with an economy of motion the convent prized as a virtue. Chanel later spoke rarely and inconsistently about those years, sometimes hiding them entirely, but the skill she left with was undeniable. After a brief stint singing in provincial cabarets, where she picked up the nickname Coco, she began making hats, first for herself and friends, then for paying customers, working from a small millinery shop funded by a wealthy admirer. The hats sold. So soon after did simple jersey dresses cut with the same plain unfussy lines the convent had drilled into her hands, a sharp break from the corseted, elaborate fashion still dominating Paris at the time. What Chanel understood, whether or not she credited the orphanage for it, was that the discipline of simple, clean construction could be its own kind of luxury. Where other designers piled on decoration, she stripped it away, and wealthy women who had spent their lives in restrictive clothing found something close to relief in what she offered. The house she built from that first hat shop became one of the most enduring fashion empires of the 20th century, and pieces from her earliest collections are still referenced by designers who have likely never set foot in a convent classroom. She rarely spoke of the nuns by name, though photographs of the orphanage's sewing room, once you know to look, resemble nothing so much as an early Chanel workshop. The stitches taught in silence became a signature spoken everywhere. Sarah Breedlove was born on a Louisiana cotton plantation in 1867 to parents who had been enslaved there only a few years earlier, and she was orphaned by age 7, raised afterward by an older sister. She worked as a washerwoman for most of her 20s and 30s, earning barely enough to survive, and she suffered from a scalp condition that caused problem for black women of the period whose access to hygiene products and healthy diets was often limited by poverty. After experimenting with homemade and commercial hair treatments, she developed her own line of hair care products designed specifically for black women's hair, built around a scalp conditioning formula and a systematic hot comb method. She married Charles J. Walker, a newspaper advertising man, and began marketing her products under the name Madam C.J. Walker, a title that projected an authority and dignity rarely extended to black women in that era's advertising. What made her fortune was not only the product but the system she built around it. Walker recruited and trained thousands of black women as door-to-door sales agents, teaching them the same techniques she had developed and paying them commissions that gave many their first taste of financial independence. She held conventions for her agents, awarding prizes not just for sales but for community service, and built a factory, laboratory, and beauty school in Indianapolis employing hundreds. By the time of her death in 1919, she was widely regarded as one of the first American women, of any race, to build a self-made fortune from nothing. Her daughter carried the business forward, and the Indianapolis headquarters she built still stands, listed today as a historic landmark. The hands that once washed other people's clothes ended up training thousands of others to build their own. In 1835, a young Connecticut store clerk named Phineas Taylor Barnum bought the right to exhibit an elderly enslaved woman he advertised as Joyce Heth, claiming she was over 160 years old and had once been George Washington's childhood nurse. The claim was almost certainly false, and the exhibition itself is a difficult, uncomfortable episode by any modern standard, but it drew enormous paying crowds across the northeastern United States and gave Barnum his first real taste of what showmanship could earn. He spent the following decades building on that lesson, that people would pay handsomely not for truth exactly, but for the experience of being astonished, entertained, or made to wonder. He opened a museum in New York filled with curiosities of wildly varying authenticity, promoted a diminutive performer he billed as General Tom Thumb into international stardom, and later built one of the largest traveling circuses in American history. His ventures did not always succeed. Barnum went through at least one significant bankruptcy after a disastrous investment in a clock company, losing much of what he had built and spending years working his way back from serious debt. He recovered, as he generally did, by returning to the one thing he understood better than almost anyone of his era, the appetite audiences had for spectacle arranged and sold to them deliberately. His circus outlived him by more than a century under other management, and his name became shorthand, fairly or not, for a certain kind of American promotional excess. The museum burned down more than once during his lifetime. He rebuilt it each time a little larger. The crowds, it turned out, were more durable than any single building he put them in. Milton Hershey opened his first candy shop in Philadelphia at 19, after finishing an apprenticeship with a candy maker in his hometown, and the business failed within 6 years, unable to compete against better-financed rivals in a crowded city. He tried again shortly afterward in New York, betting on a new formula, and that business failed too, leaving him almost nothing and a family that had largely lost patience with his repeated attempts. He returned to Pennsylvania with one asset intact, a caramel recipe using fresh milk, which he had picked up during his failed New York venture, that produced a softer, more flavorful caramel than most competitors on the market. This time the business took hold. The Lancaster Caramel Company grew quickly, and by his late 30s Hershey had, for the first time, real money. Rather than settle into caramel manufacturing, he became fascinated by German and Swiss chocolate-making machinery he saw demonstrated at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, and he sold his profitable caramel company outright to fund an entirely new venture built around mass-produced milk chocolate, a product still considered a luxury import in the United States at the time. He built a factory town from scratch in rural Pennsylvania, complete with housing, schools, and a trolley system for his workers, betting that affordable milk chocolate would become as ordinary a purchase as bread. He was right. The Hershey bar became one of the best-selling candies in American history, and the company weathered depressions and wars largely because Hershey had built it debt-free from the caramel sale rather than borrowed capital. The two failed shops in Philadelphia and New York are long gone, unmarked by any plaque. Only the chocolate town, built on the wreckage of caramel, still bears his actual name. When gold was discovered in California in 1848, tens of thousands of men rushed west hoping to strike it rich pulling nuggets from riverbeds. Levi Strauss went west too in 1853, but he had no interest in mining. He arrived in San Francisco to open a dry goods business, supplying the wave of miners and merchants flooding the boomtown with fabric, blankets, and clothing shipped in from his family's business back east. What the miners actually needed, it turned out, had nothing to do with luck at all. Their work clothes tore constantly, worn through at the pockets and seams, under the strain of crouching over rocky riverbeds and hauling equipment all day. A tailor named Jacob Davis, one of Strauss' regular customers, had been reinforcing pants with copper rivets at the stress points, and wanted a business partner with the capital to patent the idea properly. Strauss provided that capital, and the two secured a patent in 1873 for riveted work pants made from sturdy cotton denim. The pants sold steadily to miners, ranchers, and laborers for decades, an unglamorous practical product in an unglamorous practical business. Strauss himself never struck it rich from a single gold nugget, but he built a durable and profitable company that outlasted the gold rush itself by well over a century, as denim slowly drifted from workwear into everyday fashion across the world. The rivers that once drew fortune seekers west have long since given up their easy gold. The pants, somehow, are still exactly where the miners left them, on nearly everyone. At 16, Cornelius Vanderbilt borrowed a small sum from his mother to buy a boat and began ferrying passengers and freight across New York Harbor, competing against established operators twice his age on routes he simply worked harder and cheaper than anyone else. He repaid the loan within a year and kept expanding, adding boats, then routes, then entire steamship lines running along the eastern seaboard, and eventually to Central America and California. He earned the nickname the Commodore for his dominance of steamshipping, achieved largely through a willingness to slash fares below what rivals could sustain, absorbing short-term losses until competitors either sold out to him or went under. It was a brutal, effective strategy, and by his 60s he had already built one large fortune before turning to an entirely new industry. Railroads were at the time a fragmented, poorly coordinated business, running on incompatible schedules and gauges between competing lines. Vanderbilt applied the same instinct he had honed on the water, buying up struggling rail lines around New York and consolidating them into efficient unified systems, most notably the New York Central. He was in his 70s during much of this expansion, an age at which most of his contemporaries had already retired, and he built what became one of the largest fortunes in American history almost entirely in the second half of a very long working life. The harbour where he first borrowed his mother's money for that first small boat is now lined with office towers. He never did retire from ferries, he simply kept building bigger ones on land. Henry Ford grew up on a Michigan farm he disliked intensely, drawn instead to the machinery scattered around it, disassembling watches as a boy, and later working as an apprentice machinist in Detroit before returning briefly to farm work his father hoped would stick. It never did. Ford spent his evenings and weekends experimenting with internal combustion engines in a small workshop, building his first working automobile, which he nicknamed the Quadricycle, in 1896. 2 early companies bearing his name failed outright, undone by disagreements with investors who wanted to build expensive cars for wealthy buyers, while Ford insisted the real opportunity lay in a cheap, reliable car for ordinary families. He was pushed out of both ventures before finally securing enough independent backing to found Ford Motor Company on his own terms in 1903, at 39, an age by which many of his era's other industrial figures had already made their names. The Model T, introduced in 1908, was the vehicle Ford had wanted to build all along, simple, durable, and priced to fall within reach of a growing middle class. To make enough of them, Ford's engineers refined the moving assembly line, cutting the time to build a single car from over 12 hours to roughly 90 minutes, and the resulting drop in production costs let Ford lower the car's price repeatedly even as demand climbed. He never fully left the tinkering habit behind, reportedly still fiddling with small mechanical puzzles well into old age. The farm he abandoned as a boy sits preserved today, a short drive from the factories that replaced it. Marcus Licinius. Crassus came from a wealthy Roman family, but he lost most of that inheritance during the brutal proscriptions that followed the civil wars of the 80s BCE, when the dictator Sulla seized the property of his political enemies, including much of the Crassus family's estate. Crassus fled Rome for a time and returned with little beyond his name and his ambition, determined to rebuild what had been taken. What he built instead of a military reputation first was a real estate empire, and the method he used has unsettled historians for 2,000 years. Rome's densely packed wooden buildings burned constantly, and when a fire broke out, Crassus would arrive with his own trained crew of slaves and offer to buy the burning property, and often the neighbouring buildings threatened by the spreading flames at a steep discount from owners desperate to salvage something before losing everything. Only after the sale was agreed did his crew move in to fight the fire, sometimes successfully saving structures they had just acquired for a fraction of their worth. He expanded into silver mines and slave trading as well, assembling one of the largest private fortunes in Roman history through methods that were legal by the standards of the time, even as they struck many contemporaries as morally grim. That fortune eventually bought him political power, a place in the ruling triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey, and command of a military campaign against Parthia that ended in his death, and, according to a story that may be more legend than fact, his severed head used as a prop in a royal court. Rome kept burning long after Crassus was gone. No one who bought a house from him ever seemed to ask why he arrived so quickly. The boy born Temujin was around 9 years old when his father, a minor Mongol chieftain, was poisoned by a rival clan, and the tribe his father had led promptly abandoned Temujin's mother and her children, judging them too weak to be worth protecting. The family survived for years on the steppe scavenging roots, small game and fish, a stunning fall for a chieftain's son, and Temujin was at one point captured and held as a slave by a rival clan before escaping. What followed was one of history's more remarkable reversals. Temujin rebuilt alliances slowly, first through marriage, then through a growing reputation as a fair and effective leader who rewarded loyalty regardless of a follower's birth, a break from the rigid clan hierarchies that had left his own family exposed. By his 40s he had unified the fractious Mongol tribes under his rule and taken the title Genghis Khan, meaning something close to universal ruler. The empire that followed grew into the largest contiguous land empire in history, and its wealth came not primarily through plunder alone, but through the deliberate protection and taxation of trade routes, stretching from China to Europe, a network historians often call the Mongol Peace, under which merchants could move goods across enormous distances with unusual safety. Silk, silver and information flowed along those roads in volumes unseen before, or, in some respects, for centuries after. The boy left to starve on the steppe became the architect of the very trade network that made much of Eurasia wealthy for a generation. His burial site, deliberately hidden, has never been found. In 1922, Smyrna, a prosperous Greek and Armenian trading city on the Anatolian coast, was burned and its population expelled or killed amid the closing violence of the Greco-Turkish War. Aristotle Onassis, a teenager from a comfortable merchant family in the city, escaped with his father to a Greek naval ship and arrived in Buenos Aires not long after with very little money and almost none of his family's former standing. He worked briefly as a dishwasher and a telephone repairman before finding steadier footing importing Turkish tobacco leaf, a trade he understood from his family's business back in Smyrna, and by his early 20s he had built a modest but genuinely successful tobacco importing operation in Argentina. That success gave him his first real capital, and rather than simply expand within tobacco, Onassis noticed something else during the Great Depression. Shipping companies desperate to unload freighters at a fraction of their pre-war value. He bought several Canadian steamships at deeply discounted prices in the early 1930s, entering the shipping business at precisely the moment most owners were fleeing it, and expanded steadily over the following decades, eventually building one of the largest privately owned tanker fleets in the world. His later life, marked by high-profile relationships and a famously private island, tends to overshadow the earlier decades of patient, unglamorous trading that actually built the fortune underneath all of it. Smyrna, the city he fled as a teenager, was rebuilt under a different name. The tobacco warehouses of Buenos Aires that gave him his start are mostly gone now too. Amadeo Giannini's stepfather ran a produce business in San Francisco, and Giannini worked the produce stalls himself as a young man, learning to judge character quickly by dealing directly with the immigrant farmers and dock workers who made up much of the city's working population. What he noticed, watching those transactions, was how badly the city's established banks served exactly these people, refusing small loans to labourers and immigrants that the bankers considered too risky or simply beneath their attention. In 1904, he founded the Bank of Italy specifically to serve the overlooked population, offering small loans to fishermen, farmers and shopkeepers that larger institutions turned away, often based on little more than a face-to-face conversation and Giannini's own judgment of the borrower's character and prospects. It was at the time an almost radical banking philosophy, betting that working people repaid loans as reliably as wealthy ones, if not more so. The test of that philosophy came in 1906, when a massive earthquake and the fires that followed destroyed much of San Francisco, including most of the city's bank buildings and their vaults. While larger banks announced they would need weeks before resuming any lending, Giannini set up a makeshift desk on a wharf using 2 barrels and a plank, and began issuing loans to rebuild the city almost immediately, working essentially on trust and memory, since his own bank's physical records had survived only because he had removed them before the fires reached his building. That bank grew over the following decades, through mergers and expansion, into what became Bank of America. The wharf where he set up that plank desk is a stone's throw from a very different kind of bank building today. Conrad Hilton grew up in a remote New Mexico trading post his father ran, where the families sometimes took in travelers for a small fee when the local hotel was full, an arrangement young Conrad handled personally, learning early how to make a stranger comfortable for a night in exchange for whatever they could pay. He clerked in his father's store for years afterward, a slow, modest apprenticeship in a business built almost entirely on trust with customers who might not return for months. His father's death and a post-war economic downturn left the family finances strained, and Hilton headed to Texas in 1919 hoping to buy a small bank, only to find the deal had fallen through by the time he arrived. Looking for another opportunity in the same oil boom town, he instead bought a small, crowded hotel that was turning away guests nightly for lack of rooms, a business he understood far better than banking anyway, given his childhood behind that trading post counter. He expanded from that single Texas hotel steadily through the 1920s, weathering the Great Depression by restructuring debts and holding on to properties other owners were forced to sell, before rebuilding aggressively afterward into a chain that eventually spanned the country and then the world. He was particular about small details in every property he acquired, insisting on clean lobbies and functioning plumbing at a time when many hotels treated such basics as optional. The trading post where he first learned to host a stranger for the night no longer stands. The habit of asking a guest if their room is comfortable, though outlived the building by a very long way. Walt Disney's first animation studio in Kansas City folded within a year, undone by a lack of steady clients and Disney's own inexperience running a business, and he moved to Hollywood in 1923 with very little money, taking on freelance work to survive while trying to build a second studio with his brother Roy. That second attempt found modest early success with a character called Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, distributed through a studio executive named Charles Mintz. The arrangement collapsed disastrously in 1928 when Disney traveled to New York, expecting to negotiate a better distribution deal, and instead learned that Mintz had quietly hired away most of Disney's own animators, and, because of how the original contract was written, retained legal ownership of the Oswald character itself. Disney left New York having lost both his creative property and much of his staff in a single meeting, forced to rebuild from almost nothing for the second time in 5 years. On the train ride home, according to accounts he gave later in life, Disney began sketching a new character, a mouse, designed deliberately to be simple enough for a small studio to animate cheaply and distinctive enough that no contract clause could quietly strip it away from him again. Mickey Mouse debuted the following year in one of the first cartoons synchronized with sound, and its success gave Disney the leverage and capital to build the studio that eventually produced feature-length animated films no one believed audiences would sit through. Oswald the Lucky Rabbit eventually returned to Disney's ownership. Decades later, in an unrelated corporate trade, the rabbit came home. The mouse by then no longer needed the company. George Eastman was 8 years old when his father died, leaving his mother to support 3 children by running a boarding house in Rochester, New York, a business that kept the family fed, but left little room for anything beyond necessity. Eastman left school early to work as an office boy and later a bank clerk, contributing his modest wages to the household while spending his evenings on a hobby that had begun to fascinate him: photography. The photography of the era was a cumbersome, chemical-heavy process, requiring photographers to coat glass plates with light-sensitive emulsion themselves shortly before each shot, then develop them almost immediately afterward, often hauling a portable darkroom on any outing. Eastman, working nights in his mother's kitchen, spent years experimenting with dry photographic plates that could be prepared in advance and developed later, a process he eventually patented and began manufacturing commercially, finally allowing him to leave his bank job behind. He pushed further, developing flexible roll film to replace heavy glass plates entirely, and in 1888 introduced the Kodak camera, a simple box design sold with the promise that customers need only press a button, after which the entire camera could be mailed back to the factory for the film to be developed, and a new roll loaded, with the pictures returned by post. The slogan built around that promise, "You press the button, we do the rest," turned photography from a specialist's trade into an ordinary household activity almost overnight. His mother's boarding house is long gone, its exact location now uncertain even in Rochester. The kitchen where he first experimented with dry plates, by contrast, is preserved today as part of a museum. Zach H. Kerr was born around 1400 in Bourges to a moderately prosperous furrier, a respectable but unremarkable trade in a France still exhausted by decades of war with England. Kerr entered commerce young and through a series of increasingly ambitious ventures in Mediterranean trade, dealing in silk, spices and metals moving between France and the Levant. He built a personal fortune large enough that by most accounts, the wealthiest private individual in the entire kingdom. That wealth drew the attention of King Charles VII, whose treasury had been drained by the long war against England, and Kerr was appointed royal treasurer in 1439, effectively becoming the crown's personal banker. He financed critical stages of the French military campaigns that eventually drove English forces out of most of France, lending the king enormous sums against future tax revenues and royal favours, an arrangement that made him indispensable at court and, inevitably, deeply resented by nobles who owed him money they had little intention of repaying. The resentment came due in 1451, when Kerr was suddenly arrested on charges, widely believed even at the time to be fabricated, that included poisoning a royal mistress. He was stripped of his fortune, most of which was seized by the crown, and quietly redistributed among the same nobles who had accused him, and spent years imprisoned before eventually escaping and dying in Mediterranean exile, serving the Pope's fleet against Ottoman forces. His grand house in Bourges, built at the height of his wealth, still stands as a museum today. The king who owed him everything never repaid a coin of it. The Medici family's earliest documented wealth in Florence came not from banking at all, but from the wool trade, a business several branches of the family pursued with modest, unremarkable success through the 14th century, one workshop among many in a city crowded with textile merchants. It was Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, in the final years of that century, who shifted the family's focus decisively toward banking, building relationships with the papacy that would define the family's fortune for generations. Giovanni's bank prospered quietly by managing papal finances, a business that was as much about earning trust as earning interest, since the church's own doctrine on usury made explicit lending arrangements a delicate matter requiring careful structuring. His son Cosimo inherited both the bank and Giovanni's careful, understated approach to power, preferring to influence Florentine politics from behind the scenes rather than seize formal office outright, a strategy that let the family accumulate enormous informal authority, while appearing on paper to be simply prosperous private citizens. By the time Cosimo's grandson Lorenzo took charge of the family's interests, the bank's wealth had funded churches, libraries, and a wave of artistic patronage that historians now treat as central to the broader flowering of the Italian Renaissance, though the underlying business, at its foundation, remained the unglamorous work of moving money safely and profitably across a fragmented Europe of competing currencies and unreliable roads. The original wool workshops that started it all left almost no physical trace in modern Florence. The bank's old ledgers, by contrast, are still carefully preserved, studied by historians who find the wool trade a curious footnote to everything that followed. Heinrich Schielmann grew up in modest circumstances in northern Germany, the son of a pastor whose reputation and finances were both damaged by scandal, and Schliemann left formal schooling behind as a teenager to work as an errand boy in a village grocery, a job he later described with visible distaste in his memoirs. He was fascinated from childhood by stories of ancient Troy, a fixation his family regarded as an impractical daydream given their actual financial circumstances. Rather than abandon the daydream, Schliemann spent his 20s and 30s building the practical means to eventually chase it. He taught himself a striking number of languages through a rigorous, self-devised memorization method, and used that linguistic skill to build a successful trading career, first as a clerk in Amsterdam, then independently in Russia, dealing in indigo dye and other commodities, and later in gold trading connected to the California gold rush, a venture he pursued from a considerable distance without ever mining an ounce of it himself. By his mid-40s, Schliemann had accumulated enough wealth from these ventures to retire from commerce entirely and fund his own archaeological expeditions, something almost no one of humble origin could otherwise have afforded, since serious excavation required paying and housing large teams of labourers for months at a stretch. He began digging at a mound in northwestern Turkey called Hisarlik in the 1870s, and the layered ruins he uncovered there are now widely identified, with real archaeological caveats about his rough methods, as the site of ancient Troy. The grocery where he once ran errands as a boy has long since vanished from any map. The city he spent a fortune digging up, by contrast, is now a protected historical site. Alfred Nobel's father, Emanuel, was an inventor and engineer whose businesses in Sweden failed twice, driving the family into genuine poverty during Alfred's early childhood before an eventual temporary recovery in Russia building military equipment. Alfred grew up watching his father's fortune swing violently between promise and collapse, an education in risk that shaped him long before he ever touched an explosive chemical himself. By his 20s, Nobel had turned his attention to nitroglycerin, a liquid explosive far more powerful than gunpowder but dangerously unstable, prone to detonating without warning during transport or storage. That instability was not an abstract risk to the Nobel family. In 1864, an explosion at their factory outside Stockholm killed several workers, including Alfred's younger brother Emil, a tragedy that devastated the family and might reasonably have ended most people's interest in the substance entirely. Nobel instead redoubled his research into making nitroglycerin safer to handle, eventually discovering that mixing it with a porous, absorbent mineral called kieselguhr produced a stable paste that could be shaped, transported, and detonated reliably on command. He patented the resulting product as dynamite in 1867, and it transformed construction and mining industries worldwide, allowing tunnels, canals, and railway cuts to be excavated at a speed and scale previously impossible. Nobel became extraordinarily wealthy from the patent and its many industrial licenses, holding hundreds of patents by the time of his death. Haunted by an erroneous obituary that portrayed him as a merchant of death, he redirected much of his fortune in his will toward prizes recognizing achievements in science, literature, and peace. The factory where his brother died no longer produces anything at all. The prizes his fortune funds, by contrast, are announced every year without fail. John Jacob Astor left his family's modest butcher shop in the German village of Waldorf as a teenager, travelling first to London to work briefly in his brother's musical instrument business before crossing the Atlantic to New York in 1784, with, by most accounts, very little money and a small stock of flutes he hoped to sell. What actually caught his attention on later in life was as a fellow passenger's description of the enormous profits available in the North American fur trade. Astor pursued that opportunity with a directness that set him apart from most merchants of the time, personally travelling into frontier territory to negotiate directly with trappers and indigenous traders for furs. He could then ship to European markets at a substantial markup, cutting out layers of middlemen that had eaten into other merchants' profits. He founded the American Fur Company in 1808, and through a combination of aggressive expansion and, at times, government favour secured through political connections, built a trading network that came to dominate fur commerce across much of the continent. As the fur trade's long-term prospects began to look less certain by the 1830s, largely due to overhunting depleting beaver populations across the trapped regions, Astor shifted much of his fortune into New York City real estate, buying land steadily on the reasonable bet that a growing city would need ever more of it. That real estate holding grew for decades after his death, and by the time later generations of Astors were counted among America's wealthiest families, most of that wealth traced back to land purchases made with fur trading profits from a man who had started his American life selling flutes. The butcher shop in Waldorf has been preserved as a small museum. The land he bought in Manhattan, unlike the furs that funded it, never once went out of fashion. Stephen Girard went to sea from the French port of Bordeaux at 14, blind in one eye from childhood illness, and largely self-educated after leaving school at an early age, working his way up gradually from cabin boy to ship's captain over more than a decade at sea. He settled in Philadelphia in the 1770s, building a shipping business trading with the Caribbean, and eventually much of the world, a business he ran with a personal frugality and attention to detail that struck many contemporaries as unusually severe for a man of growing wealth. His reputation shifted during the yellow fever epidemic that struck Philadelphia in 1793, when Girard, already a successful merchant, personally took charge of a hospital caring for the sick, at a time when the disease was killing residents by the thousands, and many wealthy citizens had fled the city entirely. He nursed patients directly himself for weeks, a level of personal risk few merchants of his standing would have accepted, and the episode earned him a lasting civic respect that outlasted his later, less flattering reputation as an exceptionally tight-fisted businessman. By the War of 1812, Girard had become, through shipping and increasingly through banking, one of the wealthiest individuals in the young United States, and when the federal government struggled to finance the war effort after its national bank's charter had lapsed, Girard personally subscribed to the overwhelming majority of a critical government loan that most other financiers considered too risky to touch, effectively propping up federal war finances with his own private fortune. He left the bulk of that fortune upon his death to fund a school for orphaned boys that still operates in Philadelphia today. The eye he lost as a child never once slowed the hand that signed that loan. Florence Nightingale Graham grew up on a small farm outside Toronto, one of several children in a family with little spare money, and she left school in her teens to help support the household, eventually training briefly as a nurse's assistant an experience that gave her an early, practical curiosity about skin treatments used to soothe patients. She moved to New York City in her early 20s with almost no savings, working first as a bookkeeper for a small pharmaceutical company before taking a position at a skincare salon run by a woman named Elizabeth Hubbard. That partnership dissolved within a year over creative disagreements, but Graham kept the salon's Fifth Avenue location and, in a decision that reveals as much about branding instinct as any product she ever developed, kept part of her former partner's name as well, rebranding herself entirely as Elizabeth Arden, a persona with no direct relationship to the woman who was actually born Florence Nightingale Graham. Under that invented name, she built one of the earliest true cosmetics empires in the United States, developing a signature red lipstick that became closely associated with the women's suffrage movement after Arden reportedly distributed samples to marchers in a 1912 demonstration and pioneering the concept of a day spa, offering both beauty treatments and light exercise routines decades before either idea became commonplace. Her products eventually reached department stores and salons across dozens of countries. The farm outside Toronto where she grew up sold beauty products of an entirely different kind, mostly root vegetables. She kept the invented name until her death, and almost no customer she ever served knew it was not real. Helena Rubinstein grew up in a large, financially modest Jewish family in Krakow, one of 8 daughters, and she left Poland in her early 20s for Australia to stay with relatives, carrying with her a small jar of face cream her mother had made from local ingredients, a family recipe with no particular commercial ambition attached to it at the time. In Melbourne, Rubinstein noticed how badly the harsh Australian climate treated the skin of local women, many of whom had no access to anything beyond basic soap. She began selling small batches of her mother's cream to local women, initially through personal referrals, and the demand grew quickly enough that she opened her first proper salon within a few years, marketing the cream with a scientific-sounding vocabulary about skin nourishment that set it apart from the plainer cosmetic products available at the time. She expanded to London, and then Paris, and eventually to the United States, building a genuine international cosmetics business years before most of her competitors thought to look beyond a single national market. Her chief rival for decades was Elizabeth Arden, another immigrant woman building a nearly identical business almost in parallel, and the two competed with an intensity that became legendary within the industry, reportedly never once meeting socially, despite operating salons within blocks of each other in several cities. Rubinstein was famously blunt about the rivalry, once noting that Arden had good taste but poor business sense, a claim that history has judged with considerable skepticism given how large both companies eventually grew. Rubinstein's family recipe cream, reformulated many times, remained a foundational product line for the company for decades afterward. The two women, by most accounts, never did meet. Von Siemens was the fourth of 14 children born to a Prussian farming family whose finances grew steadily worse through his childhood. And, with little money available for a formal university education, Siemens instead enrolled in the Prussian Army's artillery and engineering school, one of the few paths available to a young man of his background that offered rigorous technical training free of tuition. The military education, intended to produce artillery officers, exposed Siemens to early electrical experiments circulating among European engineers at the time, and he became increasingly fascinated by the emerging science of electromagnetism, tinkering with telegraph designs in whatever spare time his military duties allowed. In 1847, while still serving as an army officer, he developed an improved telegraph design using a needle-based pointer system that was more reliable than existing designs, and he partnered with a skilled mechanic named Johann Georg Halske to found a company to manufacture and install the devices. That small telegraph workshop grew rapidly as European governments and railway companies raced to build telegraph networks across their expanding territories, and Siemens secured contracts to lay lines across Prussia, Russia, and eventually a telegraph cable stretching from London to Calcutta, one of the longest such lines in the world at the time. The company diversified over subsequent decades into electrical generators, lighting, and eventually a wide range of industrial and consumer electrical technology, growing into one of Europe's most significant engineering enterprises. Siemens left the army only once the telegraph business had grown secure enough to support him fully. The artillery training that was meant to teach him to aim cannons ended up teaching him to wire a continent instead. Shmai M. Shell Rotit Shield grew up in the Judengasse, the narrow, overcrowded street to which Frankfurt's Jewish population was legally confined in the 18th century, a neighborhood of cramped houses and strict civic restrictions on where Jewish residents could work, live, or even walk on certain days. His family dealt in rare coins and second-hand goods, a trade Rothschild inherited and gradually expanded, developing a genuine expertise in identifying and pricing old and unusual currency that caught the attention of wealthy collectors, including members of the local aristocracy. That coin trading led naturally into the business of bills of exchange. The paper instruments merchants and nobles used to move money across a fragmented patchwork of German states, each with their own currency, and Rothschild built a reputation for discretion and reliability that attracted increasingly prominent clients, including the ruling prince of Hesse-Kassel. His 5 sons were trained in the family business from childhood, and as they came of age, Rothschild sent them out to establish banking houses in London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples, while the eldest remained in Frankfurt, creating a coordinated network of family banks across the continent's major financial centres. That network proved unusually resilient during the political upheavals of the early 19th century, since information and funds could move between the brothers faster and more reliably than through the ordinary banking channels, available to competitors confined to a single city or state. The resulting Rothschild banking dynasty became one of the most influential financial forces in 19th century Europe, financing government loans, infrastructure projects, and, at various points, entire war efforts. The Judengasse itself was largely destroyed by bombing in the 20th century. A handful of Rothschild family banks, remarkably, are still operating today. Jay Gould grew up on a small, unproductive New York farm, a sickly child whose father struggled to make the land profitable, and Gould left home in his teens to support himself, working first as a bookkeeper and then teaching himself surveying, a skill he used to produce and sell detailed county maps across upstate New York, an unglamorous but steady trade that gave him his first real savings. He used those savings to buy a small stake in a tannery, his first taste of investing beyond simple wage labour, and though that particular venture ended in a bitter partnership dispute, it introduced Gould to the world of business speculation that would define the rest of his career. He moved into railroad securities in his late 20s, at a time when American railroads were expanding rapidly, and their stocks, often thinly traded and loosely regulated, offered enormous opportunities for a sharp, patient operator willing to accumulate quiet control of a company's shares before its value became obvious to others. Gould's methods earned him a reputation, fair or not, as one of the most ruthless financiers of the Gilded Age, involved in disputes and legal battles over control of railroads, including the Erie Railroad and later the Union Pacific, and implicated in a notorious attempt to corner the American gold market in 1869 that caused a brief but severe financial panic when the scheme unravelled. He was, by most contemporary accounts, an intensely private, sickly, and unpopular man even as his fortune grew into one of the largest in the country. The farm where he grew up sickly and poor produced almost nothing worth remembering. The railroads he later controlled, whatever else is said of the man, are mostly still running today. Marshall Field left his family's small Massachusetts farm at 17 to clerk in a dry goods store in a nearby town, earning modest wages while learning the fundamentals of retail, from stocking shelves to the careful personal attention required to keep a small store's regular customers loyal. Within a few years he moved to Chicago, a rapidly growing city where the retail trade was expanding fast enough to reward genuine ambition, and he worked his way up through a series of dry goods partnerships over the following decade. What set Field apart once he gained real control of his own store was an unusually firm commitment to policies that were, at the time, far from standard practice, including a strict no-haggling fixed price system and an unconditional promise that customers could return unsatisfactory goods for a full refund, a guarantee many competitors considered financially reckless. Field's insistence was that trust, extended generously and consistently, would build a loyal customer base larger than any single transaction's short-term profit could justify, and the strategy worked, drawing customers who valued the predictability of shopping somewhere that would not haggle or argue. The store survived a catastrophic setback in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, which destroyed the building entirely, by rebuilding within roughly a year on an even larger scale, and Marshall Field and Company grew over subsequent decades into one of the largest and most influential department stores in the country, credited with popularizing retail practices, from personal shopping assistants to elaborate seasonal window displays that became standard across the entire industry. The original small Massachusetts dry goods store where Field first clerked closed its doors long ago. The no-haggling policy he insisted on, largely unremarkable now, was considered close to eccentric when he began it. Smarker. Guggenheim arrived in Philadelphia from Switzerland in 1848 with little formal education and, according to family law that has been repeated for generations, only a small amount of money left in his pocket after the crossing. He began work as a peddler, walking door to door selling stove polish and household lace, an unglamorous trade that nonetheless taught him a great deal about identifying which products people were willing to pay a premium for and which they would simply do without. He expanded steadily from peddling into manufacturing his own lace and embroidery goods, building a genuinely profitable business over several decades that gave him and his growing family of sons a comfortable, though not yet spectacular, standard of living. The turning point came in the early 1880s, when Guggenheim, encouraged by a business partner, invested in 2 struggling silver and lead mines in Colorado that most established mining investors had largely written off as poor prospects. Guggenheim's mines, rather than the silver everyone expected, turned out to contain far more valuable deposits of lead and, crucially, copper, a metal whose demand was about to surge dramatically as electrification spread across the country and the world, requiring vast quantities of copper wire. Guggenheim and his sons expanded aggressively into copper smelting and mining across the Americas over the following decades, building a business that came to dominate a significant share of global copper production by the early 20th century. The stove polish and lace business that gave the family its first modest comfort barely rates a mention in most accounts of the Guggenheim fortune. The copper mines that followed it, by contrast, built a name now attached to museums on more than one continent. Isaac Singer left home at 12 and spent much of his early adulthood drifting between travelling theatrical troupes, performing minor roles under a stage name while working odd jobs, as a mechanic between engagements to keep himself fed, an unstable existence that left him broke more often than not through his 20s and 30s. He had a genuine mechanical talent, developing several minor inventions along the way, including an improved rock drilling machine and a wood carving device, though neither earned him lasting money. In 1850, while repairing a competitor's sewing machine in a Boston workshop, Singer became convinced he could design a significantly better version, and within a matter of weeks he produced a working model that improved on existing designs with a straight, continuous stitching needle and a stable table mounting that made the machine far easier for a home seamstress to operate reliably. He patented the design and, crucially, partnered with a lawyer named Edward Clark who understood something Singer himself did not fully grasp, that most households could not afford to buy such a machine outright. Clark developed an installment payment plan, allowing customers to pay for a Singer sewing machine gradually over months, rather than in a single purchase, one of the earliest widespread uses of consumer credit for a household good, and the combination of Singer's improved mechanism and Clark's payment innovation drove sales dramatically, making the Singer Manufacturing Company one of the first true multinational manufacturing corporations. Singer's personal life remained famously chaotic, with multiple concurrent families discovered. Only after his death forced a complicated inheritance settlement. The theatrical troupes he once drifted between left no lasting record at all. The machines, meanwhile, are still found tucked into attics and sewing rooms more than a century and a half later. Cyrus McCormick grew up on a Virginia farm where his father, Robert, had spent years unsuccessfully attempting to design a working mechanical reaper, a machine that promised to replace the exhausting, time-consuming work of cutting grain by hand with scythes, a bottleneck that limited how much land a single farming family could realistically harvest each season. Cyrus took up his father's unfinished project in his early 20s, refining the design with a series of mechanical improvements that finally produced a reliably functional machine by 1831. What followed was not an immediate triumph, but a genuinely difficult decade of slow, often discouraging sales. Farmers were skeptical of the machine's reliability, wary of its cost, and reasonably cautious about abandoning familiar hand-harvesting methods for an unproven mechanical alternative. McCormick spent years traveling to agricultural fairs across the Midwest, personally demonstrating the reaper's capabilities in public field trials, sometimes against hand-cutting crews in staged competitions designed to prove the machine could outwork several men at once. The demonstrations gradually built credibility, and McCormick made a decisive strategic choice in 1847, relocating his manufacturing operation to Chicago to be closer to the vast grain-growing prairies of the expanding Midwest, a region far better suited to his machine's advantages than the smaller, hillier farms of his native Virginia. Sales accelerated through the 1850s and 1860s as westward agricultural expansion created exactly the kind of large, flat grain fields where a mechanical reaper's advantages were most dramatic, and McCormick's company grew into a dominant force in American agricultural machinery. His father's original unsuccessful design attempts are barely remembered today, footnotes to his son's eventual success. The fairs where he once demonstrated the reaper against exhausted hand-cutting crews are long since gone, though the machines that won those contests are still occasionally found rusting in old barns. Charles Goodyear ran a modest hardware business in Philadelphia in the early 1830s that failed under the weight of debts he had inherited, partly from his father's earlier struggling ventures, and Goodyear was imprisoned for debt on at least one occasion, a common legal consequence at the time for unpaid creditors, an experience that left him with a lasting personal familiarity with genuine poverty rather than the comfortable distance most successful inventors of the era enjoyed. While still in significant financial distress, Goodyear became fascinated with rubber, a material that was, at the time, notoriously unreliable, turning brittle in cold weather and sticky, foul-smelling, and unusable in heat, limiting its commercial applications, despite genuine interest from manufacturers hoping to find a way around the problem. Goodyear spent years experimenting obsessively with various chemical treatments intended to stabilize rubber's properties, often working in makeshift home laboratories while his family lived in genuine hardship, at times relying on charity from neighbors to eat. His breakthrough came in 1839 when he discovered, reportedly partly by accident after rubber mixed with sulfur was left too close to a hot stove, that heating rubber with sulfur produced a durable, stable material that retained flexibility across a much wider range of temperatures, a process he patented as vulcanization. The discovery transformed rubber into one of the industrial materials of the coming century, used eventually in everything from tires to industrial belting. Goodyear, despite holding the foundational patent, struggled for the rest of his life, with expensive legal battles defending it against infringement, and legal fees combined with continued poor business judgment left him in debt when he died in 1860, the rubber industry that grew explosively in the decades after his death, including companies that would later carry his name without any direct ownership stake for his descendants, built vast fortunes for men who were, in most cases, simply better at business than Goodyear had ever managed to be. The stove that reportedly triggered his breakthrough discovery is, unsurprisingly, long gone. His name endures on tires driven by people who have likely never heard the story of the man who died still, owing money for the invention underneath them. Jacob Fugger was born into a family of Augsburg weavers who had, over a couple of generations before his birth, expanded cautiously from textile production into trading the cloth themselves across southern Germany, a modest but genuinely profitable step up from simple manufacturing. Jacob, one of several brothers in the family business, was sent to Venice as a young man for training in the sophisticated banking and accounting techniques Italian merchants had developed, skills that were still relatively unfamiliar north of the Alps. What Fugger brought back from that training, combined with his family's existing trading network, allowed him to build a business that moved decisively beyond textiles into mining, particularly silver and copper extraction across Central Europe, and into banking on a scale few German merchant families had previously attempted. His most consequential relationships were with the Habsburg family, whom he financed extensively, most famously providing the enormous loan that secured Charles V's election as Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, a payment historians widely credit with determining the outcome of that contested imperial election. Fugger's fortune, built on mining royalties, banking interest, and the political leverage that enormous wealth naturally purchased, has been estimated by some economic historians as proportionally among the largest personal fortunes in recorded history relative to the economies of his time, though such comparisons across centuries remain necessarily imprecise. He used part of that wealth to fund a still operating charitable housing complex in Augsburg for the city's poor, a project that continues today under terms remarkably close to his original endowment. The original weaving workshop that started the family's rise left no trace in modern Augsburg. The housing complex he funded for the poor, remarkably, still shelters residents on the same terms he set nearly 5 centuries ago. Shen Wan-san, whose given name was likely Shen Fu, appears in historical records as a genuinely wealthy merchant operating in the lower Yangtze region during the early Ming dynasty, a period of significant commercial growth along China's river trade routes. The documented facts of his life are thin, but by most accounts he built his fortune through trade in grain, textiles and other goods, moved along the rivers connecting inland producers to coastal markets, a business that rewarded exactly the kind of patient, well-connected merchant Shen appears to have been. What survives far more vividly than the documented business record is the folklore that grew up around him within a generation or two of his death. Most famously, story that Shen owned a magical basin capable of endlessly multiplying whatever coins or treasure were placed inside it overnight. An explanation for his wealth that later stories found more satisfying than ordinary river trade. Historians generally treat the basin story as a folk elaboration layered onto a real historical merchant, the kind of legend that tends to accumulate around anyone whose wealth seems to a later audience too large to explain through ordinary means. The more solidly documented part of Shen's story is his fall. According to several historical accounts, Shen contributed heavily to the construction of the new Ming capital's walls, a gesture some sources describe as an attempt to curry favour with the founding emperor, Zhu Yuanzhang, who was famously suspicious of wealthy subjects whose fortunes rivaled his own authority. That contribution, rather than earning gratitude, is said to have provoked imperial anger at a merchant appearing to outspend the state itself, and Shen was reportedly stripped of much of his wealth and exiled, a fate that fits a broader pattern of Ming emperors treating extreme private wealth as a political threat. The basin, if it ever existed outside of storytelling, was never recovered. The walls he is said to have helped fund, unlike the fortune that built them, are still standing in Nanjing today. Benjamin Franklin was apprenticed at 12 to his older brother James, a Boston printer, under a legally binding contract that was meant to last 9 years, and the relationship between the brothers deteriorated steadily, marked by James' frequent physical punishment of his younger sibling and increasingly bitter disputes over Franklin's writing, which he had begun submitting to James' newspaper under a pseudonym. At 17, in clear violation of his apprenticeship contract, Franklin ran away to Philadelphia, arriving with almost no money and, according to his own later account, a single Dutch dollar and some spare change to his name. He found work as a printer's assistant in Philadelphia and later in London, saving carefully and observing the trade closely before returning to Philadelphia to establish his own printing business in his early 20s. Franklin proved to be an unusually disciplined businessman, publishing a widely read newspaper and, starting in 1732, an annual almanac filled with practical advice, weather predictions, and memorable proverbs that became one of the best-selling publications in the American colonies for a quarter century. The profits from printing, the almanac, and a network of print shop franchises Franklin established with former apprentices across several colonies, structured so that Franklin retained a share of each shop's profits in exchange for initial capital and training, built him a genuinely comfortable fortune by his standards. In 1748, at just 42 years old, Franklin retired from active business entirely, handing daily operations to a partner, freeing himself to pursue the scientific experiments, civic projects, and eventually the diplomatic and political career for which he is now far better remembered. His brother James' original Boston print shop, the one Franklin fled as a teenager, closed not long after. The almanac that funded his early retirement, meanwhile, kept selling for years after he had stopped needing the income at all. Osceola McCarty left school in the 6th grade in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, to care for an ill aunt, and she spent the following decades of her life washing and ironing other people's clothes by hand, work she performed quietly and without complaint from a small house she rarely left 6 days a week for the better part of 75 years. She never married, had no children, and lived with a frugality that neighbours sometimes noticed but rarely thought much about, since a black washerwoman living modestly in the segregated American South drew little attention from anyone. What almost no one around her realised was that McCarty had, decade after decade, been depositing a portion of her modest earnings into a local bank account, letting the balance grow slowly through simple, unglamorous compound interest over the course of a working life that spanned from the 1930s well into the 1990s. By the time she stopped working in her late 80s, unable to continue the physically demanding labour, that account had grown into a sum large enough to surprise even the bank employees who had watched it accumulate. In 1995, McCarty made the decision, reported widely in national news at the time, to donate the substantial majority of her savings to the University of Southern Mississippi to fund scholarships for students who could not otherwise afford tuition, an institution she herself had never had the opportunity to attend given both the era's segregation laws and her own family's poverty. The gift prompted a wave of additional donations from others moved by her example, and the scholarship fund she established has supported students for decades since. The small house where she washed clothes for most of her life still stands in Hattiesburg. She never once, by any account, thought of herself as wealthy. Russell Sage grew up on a small farm in upstate New York and left home in his early teens to clerk in his older brother's grocery store in Troy, learning the fundamentals of trade and careful bookkeeping in a business with famously thin margins that punished any carelessness with inventory or credit. That early exposure to razor-thin profit accounting appears to have shaped Sage's entire approach to money for the rest of his long life, one built almost entirely around caution rather than boldness. He moved from grocery into wholesale trading and eventually into banking and railroad investment by his 30s. And though he operated during the same Gilded age as flamboyant, headline-grabbing financiers like Jay Gould, with whom he was frequently associated in business dealings, Sage's own personal style could hardly have been more different. He was famously, almost comically frugal in his personal habits despite accumulating one of the era's largest fortunes, reportedly walking to work rather than pay for transportation and negotiating small personal expenses with the same relentless attention he applied to major financial transactions. That caution served him well during periods when more aggressive contemporaries suffered catastrophic losses in speculative crashes, since Sage generally maintained substantial cash reserves and avoided overextending himself on leveraged positions, a discipline that let him buy distressed assets cheaply from more reckless rivals during downturns rather than becoming one of the ruined himself. He built a significant fortune in railroad securities and later in a form of interest-bearing loan contract that some historians consider an early precursor to modern options trading. His personal frugality became something of a public joke even during his own lifetime, a wealthy man famous for haggling over pennies, the grocery in Troy where he learned that habit is long gone, though the habit itself, by most accounts, never left him at all. According to a tradition recorded by Spanish colonial chroniclers, an indigenous herder named Diego Huaypa was climbing a barren mountain in the Andean highlands sometime around 1545 in what is now Bolivia, searching for a llama that had wandered off when he grabbed at some brush to steady himself on the slope and pulled up a chunk of exposed rock streaked with what turned out to be nearly pure silver ore. The mountain, later named Cerro Rico, meaning rich hill, proved to contain one of the largest silver deposits ever discovered anywhere in the world. The traditional herder's discovery account should be read with some caution, since it comes to us filtered through Spanish colonial record keepers, writing years after the fact, and some historians suspect indigenous communities in the region may have already known of scattered silver deposits before any Spanish documented discovery took place. What is far better documented is what followed. The Spanish crown established the mining town of Potosi at the mountain's base, and over the following 2 centuries it grew into one of the largest and most populous cities in the entire Americas, its silver shipped by the ton back to Spain, and from there into trade networks stretching across Europe and Asia. The human cost of that silver boom was severe. The Spanish colonial mining system relied heavily on forced indigenous labour, and conditions in the mines and the mercury-based refining process used to extract silver from ore killed enormous numbers of workers over the mine's operating centuries, a toll historians still debate the full scale of. Potosís silver is credited by economic historians with fueling major shifts in global trade and contributing to significant inflation across the economies of early modern Europe as the metal flooded into circulation. Diego Huaypar's own fate after the discovery is barely recorded at all. The mountain he is said to have stumbled onto is still being mined today, nearly 5 centuries later, its silver considerably harder now to find. Samuel Colt was sent away from home as a teenager after a series of pranks and misadventures, including one involving gunpowder that reportedly got him expelled from school, and he spent several years at sea as a young sailor before returning to land, with a fascination for firearm mechanisms that had apparently occupied much of his idle time aboard ship. He carved a wooden model of a revolving cylinder pistol design during that time, an idea that would eventually define his entire career, though turning the wooden model into a working, patentable firearm took considerably longer and considerably more money than the teenage Colt actually possessed. To fund the development of his revolver design, Colt spent several years touring towns and cities as a travelling showman under the stage name Dr. Colt, giving public demonstrations of the effects of nitrous oxide, or laughing gas, on volunteers from the audience, a genuinely popular form of entertainment at the time that provided Colt with steady if modest income. He used those earnings to fund gunsmiths who could translate his revolving cylinder concept into working prototypes, eventually securing a patent in 1836 for a revolver design that allowed multiple shots to be fired without reloading between each one, a significant advance over the single-shot pistols then in common use. His first manufacturing venture in New Jersey failed within a few years, undone by high production costs and limited early military interest, and Colt returned briefly to less glamorous work before a wave of renewed demand, driven partly by the Mexican-American War and westward expansion into territories where settlers faced real security concerns, revived interest in his design. His second manufacturing venture, launched in the 1840s, succeeded where the first had not, and Colt built one of the most recognizable firearms manufacturing companies in American history. The laughing gas demonstrations that funded his early prototypes have long since faded from popular memory. The revolver that came out of them, whatever else might be said about it, has not. Ray Kroc spent much of his working life as a traveling salesman, first selling paper cups and later a milkshake mixing machine called the Multi-Mixer, a job that took him across the country visiting diners and drive-ins that might want to buy his equipment, a career that had made him a competent living but nothing close to a fortune by the time he reached his 50s, an age at which most salesmen of his era were already thinking about retirement rather than a new venture. On one of those sales trips in 1954, Kroc visited a small hamburger stand in San Bernardino, California, run by two brothers named Richard and Maurice McDonald, and he was struck not by anything particularly novel about the food itself, but by the astonishing efficiency of the kitchen system the brothers had developed, a streamlined assembly line approach that let a small staff serve customers a simple, consistent menu remarkably fast, using an unusually large number of his multi-mixers at once, which was the detail that had actually drawn Kroc's professional attention there in the first place. Kroc convinced the brothers, who had shown little ambition to expand their single successful location, to let him franchise their system nationally, and he began opening McDonald's restaurants across the country, under an agreement that gave him control over expansion, in exchange for a share of each new location's revenue flowing back to the founding brothers. Kroc's genuine talent turned out to be operational discipline at scale, enforcing rigorous standards for cleanliness, consistency, and speed across every franchised location, and he eventually bought out the McDonald brothers entirely in 1961 for a sum that, decades later, looked remarkably small given what the chain became. The original San Bernardino stand where Kroc first saw that kitchen system closed decades ago. The brothers, whose names still hang over the golden arches worldwide, sold their claim to it for what turned out to be a fraction of its eventual worth. Sam Walton grew up during the Great Depression in rural Oklahoma and Missouri, and his family's finances remained tight throughout much of his childhood, prompting Walton to take on paying work early, delivering newspapers, milking the family's cows, and selling magazine subscriptions door to door, small jobs that together taught him an early practical familiarity with customer service and the thin margins of small-scale commerce. He served in the military during the Second World War, before returning to civilian life determined to build a career in retail, a field he had grown genuinely fond of during a brief pre-war stint managing a variety store. Walton opened his own franchised variety store in Newport, Arkansas in the late 1940s and built it into one of the most successful stores in its regional franchise chain over several years, only to lose the lease unexpectedly when the building's landlord declined to renew it, a painful early setback that forced Walton to start over in a different small Arkansas town with an entirely new store. That second attempt succeeded as well, and Walton spent the 1950s and early 1960s expanding a small regional chain of variety stores across rural Arkansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma. Towns generally considered too small and too remote for larger retail chains to bother with. It was precisely that neglected rural market that gave Walton his eventual insight that a store offering genuinely low prices on everyday goods, supported by an unusually efficient distribution and inventory system, could thrive in small towns overlooked by bigger competitors focused on cities. The first store to carry the Walmart name opened in Rogers, Arkansas in 1962, and the chain expanded steadily outward from that same rural base for the following decades. The lease dispute that once forced him to abandon his first successful store in Newport has been mostly forgotten. The small towns he built the whole chain around, by contrast, remain exactly where Walmart still concentrates much of its business today. Josephine Esther Mentzer grew up in Queens, New York, above her father's hardware store, one of several children in a family of modest means with little connection to the fashionable world she would later come to define under a different name. Her uncle, a chemist, developed a series of skin creams in the family's small kitchen laboratory, and young Josephine, fascinated by the process, began helping mix and package the products as a teenager, an early apprenticeship that gave her both a genuine understanding of the formulas and a growing conviction that the products deserved a wider audience than her uncle had ever imagined for them. She adopted the more elegant-sounding name Estee Lauder as a young woman, and began selling the family's creams personally, going directly into beauty parlors and demonstrating the products on customers' hands and faces, a hands-on sales approach that let potential buyers feel the difference immediately rather than simply reading a label. That direct personal method became her signature, and it built genuine word-of-mouth loyalty long before Lauder had any real advertising budget to compete with larger established cosmetics companies. Her breakthrough came in the 1940s when she convinced a prominent New York department store to carry her line, a deal she reportedly secured partly by giving away free samples generously enough that customers kept returning specifically asking for her products by name, a practice that eventually became a standard cosmetics industry marketing technique, credited significantly to her early insistence on it. Estee Lauder companies grew over subsequent decades into one of the largest cosmetics corporations in the world, still controlled by her family long after her own death. Her uncle's small kitchen laboratory, where the very first creams were mixed, no longer exists in any recognizable form. The free sample, the habit she is often credited with popularizing, is now standard at nearly every cosmetics counter in the world. William Colgate arrived in New York from England as a young man in the 1790s, following his father's family after their earlier fortunes back in England had been damaged by his father's political entanglements, and Colgate took an apprenticeship with a soap boiler in Baltimore before setting out on his own in New York City in his early 20s to establish a soap and candle-making business. That first independent venture failed within a few years, a common enough fate for a small manufacturing business run by an inexperienced owner in a crowded, competitive trade, and Colgate found himself starting over with little capital and a damaged reputation among the few creditors he owed. Rather than abandon the trade entirely, Colgate rebuilt slowly and far more cautiously the second time, focusing on consistent quality and reliable, honest business dealings, a reputation he cultivated deliberately partly out of his own deep religious conviction, which shaped both his personal ethics and his approach to commerce throughout the rest of his life. The rebuilt business grew steadily rather than explosively, expanding from simple bar soap and candles into a wider range of household products over the following decades, and by the time of Colgate's death in 1857, the company bearing his name had become one of the most respected manufacturers of its kind in the country. Colgate himself was known for donating a significant portion of his growing income to charitable and religious causes throughout his life, a practice his descendants largely continued after his death, and the company he rebuilt from an early failure eventually grew, through later mergers and international expansion, into one of the largest consumer goods corporations in the world, still carrying his name on products sold in households across the globe. The first failed soap venture that started his American career left him with debts he spent years repaying. The second attempt, built more slowly and more carefully, outlived him by well over a century and a half. Awisa Candler trained as a pharmacist in rural Georgia and moved to Atlanta in his early 20s, working as a drugstore clerk before eventually opening his own small pharmacy business, a modest but respectable trade that made Candler a reasonably comfortable, though unremarkable, small-town professional through much of his early career. He was a careful, patient businessman with a genuine interest in patent medicines, the largely unregulated tonics and remedies that pharmacists of the era often manufactured and sold themselves alongside more conventional prescriptions. In 1888 and 1891, Candler acquired the full rights to a headache and stimulant tonic called Coca-Cola from its original creator, a fellow Atlanta pharmacist named John Pemberton, who had developed the syrup a few years earlier but had struggled to build it into a genuinely profitable business, eventually selling off pieces of the formula's rights to multiple parties in overlapping and confusing transactions before his death, in a manner that suggests Pemberton himself never fully grasped what he actually had. Candler consolidated those scattered rights and, unlike Pemberton, applied a genuinely aggressive and innovative approach to marketing the drink, distributing free coupons for a complimentary glass, placing branded clocks and calendars in drugstores across the country, and standardizing the syrup's production to ensure consistent quality at every soda fountain that served it. Under Candler's management, Coca-Cola grew from a regional Atlanta curiosity into a nationally recognized drink within about 2 decades, and Candler eventually sold the company in 1919 for a sum that made him and his family enormously wealthy, allowing him later to serve as Atlanta's mayor and to fund significant civic development across the city. John Pemberton, the syrup's original inventor, died in relative poverty just a few years after selling off the rights that made another man's fortune. The formula, whoever actually owns it today, has never once been fully written down in any single surviving document. Basil Zaharoff's early life remains genuinely murky, deliberately so by most accounts. Since he cultivated an air of mystery around his own origins for the rest of his life, but he is generally believed to have come from a poor family of Greek descent in Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, and to have worked in his youth as a small time trader and interpreter in the port cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, where his fluency in several languages proved to be his most valuable and reliably marketable skill. Zaharoff's break into the arms trade came through a distant relative connected to a Swedish weapons manufacturer, and Zaharoff proved to have a genuine, somewhat unsettling talent for the business, reportedly employing sales techniques that involved demonstrating a weapon's effectiveness to one government while quietly ensuring a rival government learned of the purchase, encouraging an arms race that, whatever its consequences, reliably generated further sales for Zaharoff's employers. He moved between several major European arms manufacturers over subsequent decades, eventually acquiring significant ownership stakes in some of them, and built connections with governments and military officials across the continent that gave him enormous, largely unaccountable influence over European defense procurement in the years leading up to the First World War. His wealth by the early 20th century was immense, and his personal history remained clouded enough by rumour and his own careful self-mythologizing that historians still debate exactly how much of the more sensational material attributed to him, tales of espionage and manipulated conflicts, reflects documented fact rather than the legend Zaharoff seemed content to let grow around his name. He was eventually knighted by the British government for wartime services and died an extraordinarily wealthy man, whose fortune's precise origins many of his own contemporaries struggled to fully account for. The port cities where he began as a poor interpreter have mostly forgotten him. The fortune he built from that obscure start, by contrast, funded institutions across Europe that still bear traces of his name today. Thomas Lipton was born to Irish immigrant parents who ran a small grocery shop in Glasgow, and he grew up helping in the store from a young age, absorbing the practical realities of retail margins before he ever left school. In his teens, Lipton travelled to the United States, working a series of jobs including on a Virginia tobacco plantation and in a New York grocery store, and he spent his time there closely observing American retail methods, including large-scale advertising and self-service store layouts, techniques that were still relatively unfamiliar back in Scotland. He returned to Glasgow in his late teens with a modest amount of savings and opened his own small grocery store, applying the American retail lessons he had absorbed, including eye-catching window displays and aggressive, sometimes theatrical, advertising stunts designed to draw crowds and generate word-of-mouth attention that a small shop could never otherwise afford. The store grew quickly into a small chain across Scotland, built on Lipton's instinct that ordinary working-class customers would respond enthusiastically to quality goods sold with genuine showmanship rather than the staid, quiet retail conventions of the era. Lipton's most significant business decision came in the 1890s, when he began purchasing tea plantations directly in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, cutting out the numerous middlemen who had traditionally stood between tea growers and the shops that sold the finished product to consumers. That vertical integration let Lipton sell high-quality tea at prices well below his competitors, and Lipton Tea became one of the most recognised tea brands in the world within a matter of years, expanding Lipton's fortune far beyond what the original Glasgow grocery could ever have generated on its own. The small Glasgow shop where he first learned the grocery trade has long since been replaced by other businesses. The tea estates he bought directly, though under different ownership since, are still growing tea in Sri Lanka today. John Wanamaker was born in Philadelphia to a brickmaker whose trade provided a steady but modest living, and Wanamaker left school as a young teenager to work as an errand boy, and then a clerk in a men's clothing store, absorbing the fundamentals of retail sales in a trade that rewarded a genuine talent for reading customers, a skill Wanamaker apparently developed quickly. By his early 20s, having saved carefully from his clerking wages, Wanamaker partnered with his brother-in-law to open a small men's clothing shop of their own in Philadelphia in 1861. That modest men's store grew steadily through the following decade, and Wanamaker introduced a series of retail practices that were, at the time, genuinely unusual for American merchants, including clearly marked, non-negotiable price tags on every item, a stark departure from the haggling customary in most stores of the period, and an unconditional money-back guarantee that let customers return goods without argument, a policy built explicitly around the idea that trust, generously extended, would earn more in repeat business than any single sale could lose through occasional returns. In 1876, Wanamaker took over an enormous former railroad depot near Philadelphia Center and converted it into one of the first true American department stores, a single building housing dozens of different product categories under one roof, an entirely new kind of shopping experience for most customers accustomed to small, specialized shops. The store eventually became famous for early adoption of technologies, including electric lighting, elevators, and even an in-store restaurant, innovations Wanamaker adopted specifically to make an entire day of shopping a genuinely pleasant experience rather than a chore. The railroad depot he converted into his flagship store still stands in Philadelphia, now serving an entirely different purpose. The money-back guarantee he insisted on as an eccentric novelty is, today, simply assumed by nearly every retail customer everywhere. Frank Woolworth grew up on a small, struggling farm in upstate New York, a life he found genuinely unpleasant, and he eventually convinced his father to let him take a job at a local dry goods store instead, hoping retail work would suit him better than farming. It did not, at least at first. Woolworth was reportedly so nervous and shy behind the counter that he struggled to approach customers at all, and his employer, frustrated by his poor early sales performance, reportedly docked his wages and at one point nearly fired him outright for his inability to actively engage shoppers the way a good clerk of the era was expected to. Rather than force himself into a salesmanship style that clearly did not suit his temperament, Woolworth began experimenting with a different approach entirely, arranging merchandise on open tables where customers could pick items up, examine them freely, and decide on a purchase without any direct sales pressure from a clerk at all, an early version of self-service retail that was at the time a genuine departure from the standard practice of a clerk personally fetching and pitching items from behind a counter. The approach happened to suit Woolworth's own reserved personality perfectly, and it also happened to work remarkably well with customers who seemed to prefer browsing freely. Woolworth opened his first store built entirely around that self-service, fixed low-price model in 1879, offering a wide range of household goods at 5 and 10 cent price points, and the format proved successful enough that Woolworth expanded it into a nationwide chain of 5 and dime stores over the following decades, eventually becoming one of the largest retail chains in the country, and funding the construction of an iconic Manhattan skyscraper that briefly held the title of the tallest building in the world. The employer who once nearly fired him for being too shy to sell is remembered today mostly as a footnote in Woolworth's own biography. The self-service format that shyness happened to invent, meanwhile, quietly became the standard way nearly everyone shops today. Theodora was born, by most surviving accounts, to a family connected to the Hippodrome in Constantinople, the enormous arena where chariot races and public entertainment drew huge crowds, and her father worked there as a bearkeeper for one of the rival factions that organised the games. A respectable but distinctly lower-class occupation in a rigidly stratified Byzantine society. After her father's death left the family in precarious financial circumstances, Theodora and her sisters reportedly turned to performing on the Hippodrome's stage themselves, a profession Byzantine society viewed with considerable scorn, often treating performers as barely a step above outright disrepute. Much of what survives about Theodoru's early life comes from the historian Procopius, whose account, particularly in his later, deeply hostile Secret History, is now widely regarded by scholars as unreliable in its most scandalous details, likely exaggerated for political effect rather than strict historical accuracy. Though the broader outline of her modest, disreputable origins appears in multiple sources and is generally accepted, what is far more solidly documented is her improbable rise. Sometime in her 20s, Theodora met Justinian, then a rising figure in the imperial court, and the two eventually married after Justinian's uncle, the reigning emperor, changed a law specifically to permit a match between an emperor's heir and a woman of Theodoru's background. Once Justinian became emperor in 527, Theodora was crowned empress and exercised genuine, substantial political influence throughout his reign, most famously during the Nika riots of 532, when a furious mob threatened to overthrow Justinian entirely, and his advisors urged him to flee the capital, only for Theodora, according to Procopius, to argue forcefully against fleeing, reportedly declaring that she would rather die wearing imperial purple than live having lost it. Justinian stayed, the riot was violently suppressed, and his reign continued for decades afterward. The Hippodrome, where she once performed as a scorned entertainer, still exists today, its outline preserved beneath modern Istanbul. She is buried, appropriately enough, in the same church her own fortune helped rebuild. Robert Smalls was born into slavery in Beaufort, South Carolina, in 1839, and as a young man he was hired out to work on the Charleston waterfront, eventually gaining detailed practical knowledge of the harbor's channels and currents through work as a deckhand, and eventually an unofficial pilot aboard a Confederate military transport ship called the Planter, a role that gave him skills far beyond what his enslaved status was legally supposed to permit him to hold. In May 1862, with the Planter's white officers ashore for the night, Smalls and a small crew of other enslaved men aboard the ship made a decision that risked their lives entirely. They piloted the vessel out of Charleston Harbor before dawn, correctly signaling past several Confederate checkpoints using signals Smalls had memorized from observing the ship's captain, and sailed directly to a Union naval blockade fleet stationed offshore, delivering not only themselves and their families, who had been secretly brought aboard, to freedom, but also the ship itself, along with a set of Confederate signal codes and harbor charts of considerable military value to Union forces. The daring escape made Smalls a genuine celebrity across the Union states, and he used that recognition to advocate successfully for the enlistment of black soldiers in the Union Army, eventually serving himself as a ship's pilot, and later a commissioned officer for Union naval forces for the remainder of the war. After the war, Smalls returned to Beaufort, purchased the very plantation house where he had once been enslaved, using earnings built through business ventures including a store and a newspaper, and went on to serve multiple terms as a United States congressman representing South Carolina during Reconstruction, a period when a small number of formerly enslaved men briefly held genuine political power in the post-war South. The house he was once enslaved in he later owned outright and lived in for the rest of his life. The harbor he piloted to freedom in the dark is, Today, simply another quiet stretch of the South Carolina coast. Meyer Guggenheim never spent that last 11 cents. Or so the family always claimed, keeping it long after the copper mines had made the coin's value beside the point entirely. Fortunes have a way of looking inevitable only in hindsight, the way a river looks like it was always going to carve its exact channel once you are standing downstream from it. Stand upstream at the actual moment, and it is just a boy peddling stove polish, a washerwoman folding someone else's shirts, a herder chasing a stray animal up a bare hillside, none of them aware that history was about to file their afternoon under a different heading entirely. Most people who peddled stove polish stayed peddlers. Most washerwomen's savings accounts never made the newspapers. Most herders who wandered a hillside found nothing but the animal they were looking for, if they were lucky, and went home for supper. The 50 people in this list are the exceptions history happened to keep a written record of, which is its own kind of quiet distortion, since the ones who tried and simply did not succeed left far less behind for anyone to later tell a story about. The suitcase Meyer Guggenheim carried off that ship is gone now, along with the ship, the harbour he landed at rebuilt many times since. The 11 cents, if it was ever really 11 cents at all, went wherever old coins go once no one is left who remembers exactly why they were worth keeping. Somewhere tonight someone is doing something similarly small and unremarkable with their hands, and no one standing nearby has any idea whether history is paying attention.